everyone, and welcome to yet again another installment of our weekly conversation series on systemic racism, PTS Response. We've made it to the end of July, and the work before us continues, but so far the company along the way has been excellent. A reminder that this is being broadcast by Zoom webinar. You can see us, we cannot see you. Your primary way of participating in this will be through the Q&A and chat pods. And if you mouse over the bottom or the top of your screen, you'll be able to wake up those menu bars and post any questions that you might have for our guests today. Last week, we spent our lunchtime talking with Pastor Alan Irizarry Graves, a 2017 graduate of the seminary and pastor to youth and college students at New Hope Baptist Church in Arkansas. Alan's conversation took a more personal turn than many of our others as he talked about his experience growing up in the foster care system, becoming Christian, and developing his dream to provide advocacy and support for those in the youth, in the juvenile detention system. The conversation ranged from his descriptions of segregation and racism in the area around Little Rock, showing up in court to be an advocate for young people in his church, his commitment to restorative justice, and becoming a first-time dad to a little boy. If you were not able to join us, please message me after this webinar, hbleier@pts.edu, and I'll happily send you the link. Listening to it will be time well spent. This week, we continue our conversation with judicatory leadership, and we'll be speaking with Bishop Kurt Kusserow of the Southwest PA Synod of the ELCA and Melissa Stoller, Director for Evangelical Mission and Assistant to the Bishop for New, Renewing, and Collaborative Ministries. Bishop Kusserow grew up in Malaysia and Singapore, where his parents served as missionaries. He's got local roots, however, and he returned to this region as a young adult, receiving a Bachelor of Arts from Thiel College and then an MDiv from Trinity Lutheran in Columbus, Ohio. After serving in a number of local parishes, he was elected to the office of the Bishop of the Southwestern PA Synod in June 2007 and was recently re-elected to a third 6-year term. He also happily serves us here at PTS on our board of directors. Reverend Melissa Stoller grew up as a pastor's kid in southern Minnesota and initially learned the Lutheran tradition in a Mission Start congregation and later in campus and camping ministry in South Dakota. She graduated with a degree in Religion and Government International Affairs from Augustana University in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and after college worked in AmeriCorps Vista in St. Paul, Minnesota, and continued as a community and issues organizer for the Minnesota Senior Federation in St. Paul. She was ordained in 2005 and has served congregations in Minnesota and Southwest PA before starting her current position at the Synod. Welcome to both of you. It's a delight to have the two of you here.
Thanks, Helen.
In this conversation, as we do each week, I like to ground our conversation in personal narrative. What stake do you have in this? So, Bishop Kusserow, I'd like to turn to you first. I know that you started off as a missionary kid, as I mentioned. Tell us a little bit about your personal commitment to and connection with the anti-racism work that we are called anew to commit to.
Yes, thanks. So it comes out of my childhood where I was raised in Malaysia and Singapore and very clearly a minority in that population. My childhood's a little farther away than it used to be these days, but I still have very strong memories of a couple of things. One is being a minority in a predominantly Asian culture, but also becoming more and more aware that the ethnic group that I belonged to was globally a group of power. And one of the ways that I remember that just striking me is coming back to the States one summer, flying through Hawaii, and looking out the windows of the airport and seeing white men doing manual labor and thinking, this is odd. I had never seen this in my growing up. And my awareness of that is something that I've carried kind of like a burden, not wanting to be associated with a group that exercises that kind of power over others. These days, our culture, our whole country is waking up to that same kind of conscience. But it's my early childhood that is speaking to my heart these days, as we become more and more aware that we belong to each other.
Melissa, I know that when we spoke in our preparatory conversation, you spoke about a watershed experience you had in college, going to school as you did near a Native American reservation. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yes, thank you. So I grew up really in a family where care for the other and understanding of others was very much valued and encouraged. And this did help me to become curious, but it wasn't until I was in college where I realized my hometown was just a few miles from a Dakota reservation, and I never really knew anything about it. So I went to Augustana, now University in Sioux Falls. It used to be a college, and had wonderful professors, including the guidance and leadership of Dr. Martin Brokenleg and his work to gently open and engage the students to understand the perspective of Indigenous people, particularly in South Dakota, in the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota tribes that still reside there. And so learning about my Dakota and Lakota neighbors a few miles away, and then growing up and learning about missionaries in South Africa, across the globe, I think it provided an excellent foundation to be curious. And as I learned about these neighbors near and far, I also learned about the systems that were set in place to divide and oppress. And I think when we learn, and that's sometimes the hardest thing we do, when we learn, we are changed. When we deeply learn and hear, we are changed. And that's maybe one of the things that we are afraid of. I know I'm afraid of still. And so I have spent a lot of my life learning, my vocation, engaging systems that oppress others, working with others to name, engage, dismantle these systems, and through community organizing and then parish ministry, and then just even in my relationships with friends and family. And now as I raise a 10-year-old white son, I want him to learn and to be curious and to not be afraid of change and to engage and work to dismantle these systems as well.
What I find interesting is how the conversation has immediately taken a turn towards awareness of systems. I mean, for you, Bishop Kusserow, being in this culture, becoming aware of the systemic issues that made folks who looked like you enjoyers of privilege and power in a way that was not universal among people. And then for you, Melissa, becoming aware of systems. So it wasn't an awareness of interpersonal behaviors or interpersonal relationships first. It was an awareness of a systemic thing. And I think that's been a real challenge for a lot of particularly white people to begin to recognize that so much of the rhetoric we have around racism seeks to understand it as individual things or acts that people perpetrate against one another. Let's turn now to the conversations that are happening in the ELCA. It seems that all of the denominations have been actively constructing documents, getting people together to think and articulate positions that help the church locate itself in opposition to white privilege and on the side of working towards anti-racism. I know that a recent book that was published by Black church planter Lenny Duncan has caught fire in a number of reading circles. He's got a really interesting background, former felon, African-American, church planter in the ELCA, and the title is Dear Church, a love letter from a Black preacher to the whitest denomination in the US. Those are some pretty blunt words for the title. Talk a little bit about the ELCA. Bishop, we'll begin with you as it seeks to understand its position regarding anti-racism work and white privilege and unpacks its own legacy in that regard.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for mentioning Lenny Duncan's book. What I find so important about that book is both its bold statement about how this church has failed to be the multicultural, multi-ethnic church it has desired to be for more than 30 years, and how he continues to say, "You're my people and I love you." And that the combination of those things, I think, is what makes the book so compelling. So the ELCA is just over 30 years old. It's a result of mergers of national Lutheran Church bodies. And in its beginning, it had great plans and desires to increase the percentage of non-white members very rapidly and significantly. And just a few years ago, confessed, we have failed in doing that. I've not just observed, but confessed, we have failed in doing that. We have not reached our aspirations. So that turned to some soul searching in anticipation of the 2019 church-wide assembly. And one of the things that was very, very clear was that was both the 5th anniversary of the Emanuel 9 shooting and the 400th anniversary of slaves coming to this country from Africa for the first time. So our church, living out of its understanding of failure, lifted up race relations, anti-racism, a desire to be more ethnic and more multicultural at our 2019 church-wide assembly as a centerpiece of our work. And one of the things that came out of that was the authentic diversity strategy. The thing that, I mean, it's a long document. It's worth reading the whole thing, but on the title page, it's summarized in 3 words: confession, reflection, and healing. I think those are the right 3 words. I'm going from memory. But to begin with confession, I think that is so important. And that's what we saw our church doing in our 2019 church-wide assembly. And I think it is what we understand has to be the posture of white America, generally speaking, white Lutherans, more specifically speaking, and then narrowing that circle to each one of us. We have to begin confessing our own failure and seeking to change internally so that any external change that we desire will flow out of that.
So confess, reflect, healing action. I'm going to do a quick share screen so that people can see where to find this document on the ELCA website. You should see the ELCA website right now. On the bottom where it says racial justice, there are 4 documents here that I would recommend, and then further ones underneath. So the strategy toward authentic diversity, I believe, Bishop, is the document that you were just referring to right now.
Yes.
And this other document, the Declaration of the ELCA to People of African Descent, we'll have Melissa talk about that in just a moment. Before we turn to that, one of the things that I'd like to ask, this is not unique to the ELCA. It is an entrenched problem with all white dominant churches seeking to do this work. Institutions, I can't tell you how many institutions I've worked within or for or participated in that have sought to do the same work. 30 years, a lot of really well-intentioned conversation and reflection, and it still has not become a reality. What are your thoughts about why that should be so and why it is so hard? Now, of course, you know, you've named a 400-year legacy that the church has been complicit in because, of course, you know, read something like Jennings's Christian Imagination, we see how the church has been complicit with the construction of race as a category for discrimination since the origins of the colonizing efforts of the Europeans. But more than that, I mean, still 30 years is a full generation's worth of work, and it's still so. What are your thoughts about where the obstacles and the roadblocks are for us today?
When you say us, do you mean particularly Lutherans?
I think whatever is going on with the Lutherans is probably something that is emblematic of other traditions as well, or you might be getting me to convert to Lutheranism.
No, I'll try to answer that question out of a Lutheran theological construct, and also say that I think it may be one of our obstacles to real change is that the way that we think about change is through theological constructs, when I think greater change will actually come through establishing relationships. The Lutheran Church was born out of the university. Martin Luther began the Reformation by seeking a conversation in academic circles. I mean, so that's our deepest history. And I think it continues to be the way that we think, and I use that word, think about things as we think about them theologically. So my theological answer to your question, how can this be, is that we understand people deeply, pervasively, to be self-interested. We call that sin. We believe that we are saved from sin by our Lord Jesus, who modeled an astounding self-giving rather than self-interest. And we love that, we rejoice in that, and we still find ourselves profoundly self-interested. I think it's true for all people, not just for Lutherans, but that would be our lens of how I think we would answer, why is this the case? It is because we remain sinful people to this day, and our sin always turns us inward. It turns us to be with those who are most like us. It turns us to those things which are most comfortable. It makes us avoid challenge. I mean, that's my answer to you. The reason is we're sinful people.
Melissa, as a pastor of communities over these years too, and now working with the Synod to address these concerns, what are your thoughts about why this is such an entrenched problem?
Well, as the Whitest Denomination in America, we don't have a whole lot of need to change, right? For many of us, we are benefits of that privilege, of that system. And yes, we've become comfortable with it, so much so that we've stopped seeing that we are benefits of it. However, I think that is the gift of our liturgy and of our worship tradition, to draw back to a portion from the strategy towards authentic diversity is confession. That's a part of our understanding of who we are when we gather for worship as well. We always begin with confession. And I know you wanted me to talk about it, so I'm going to lead right into the apology a little bit here, which is the other document there. Mm-hmm. The Declaration of the ELCA to People of African Descent, which was also adopted at the 2019 Church-wide Assembly. So it is a declaration, but the difference of this and what I appreciated is following that declaration is actually a list of some questions. Things like, why is the ELCA issuing this apology? Why look at slavery? It happened in the past. You know, why are we doing this? Can't we just move on? And some really good talking points that follow that, things that can be used within the congregation. So that's, I think, really our hope. As an ELCA, I'm a church-wide employee for the ELCA, as well as I'm deployed to the Southwestern Pennsylvania Synod, and working with congregations here. And I think the hope is to have things that we can invite our pastors and our congregation leaders and our deacons to lead within the communities that they serve. And so one of the things that we've heard during this time is, how do I even do this? I don't have a group of people that have the time to read a book. And some of our congregation members just aren't in places where they read long books. That's just not who they are. But what kinds of documents, what kind of resources can we have where we can begin this conversation and begin talking about it, whether in an adult forum, Sunday school. These are all very biblically based, and I appreciate that very much about the ELCA, but they have tended to stay on the shelf when they come out. And so I think this new step towards authentic diversity and sort of our initiatives from the ELCA and in our synods is to say, let's move this conversation to our congregations and our communities. And here are some ways to do so.
I think the importance of doing that came home for me, particularly in our conversation when we were prepping, and we talked about the recent recognition of the Feast Day of Emmanuel 9. And for those of you who don't know what the Emmanuel 9 is, it is the murder of 9 members of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And I know that the Lutheran Church in this area took the lead on organizing an ecumenical recognition of that anniversary. Talk to us a little bit, Melissa, about what the connection is between the ELCA and an AME church in Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, thank you. So on June 17th in 2015, a young man walked into Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and shot the members who had gathered for Bible study. And many people that are just, oh yeah, that happened, that's right. And so this year would have been 5 years since that happened. The connection that really brought it home, I think, for many of us in the ELCA is Reverend Pickney had received training, and I believe his DMin at one of our Lutheran seminaries, Southern Seminary. And the shooter, Dylan Roof, was a member of an ELCA congregation. So there we have sin held in and of itself and the brokenness of the body of Christ right there. So for us as Lutherans, it became very important that we acknowledge and name our complicitness. Just even as a whole, what in our congregations, what in our confirmation classes have we failed to teach our children and our people and one another, and have we failed to love one another well? So this commemoration, especially for this 5 years, was also voted on. I'm losing words. I am not the constitutional scholar on our staff, but it was lifted up in place. We're not going to go so far as to say feast day, I think, at this point, but the commemoration of this at a 2019 assembly this last August. And so we gathered a group of people, our Authentic Diversity and Justice Task Force, which has just begun, to say, how will we commemorate this in our synod along with the ELCA, along with our sisters and brothers. And we did so on June 17th, and then began a series of conversations within our synod. Church, we need to talk about racism.
We're going to talk about those conversations in just a minute. I just want to remind the folks who are gathered online, please use the Q&A or chat pod to offer any observations, provide a little amen corner in the screen for folks to see, or to ask any questions of Bishop Kusserow or Reverend Stoller as we continue our conversation here. You mentioned, Melissa, these synod-wide conversations about racism. Bishop Kusserow, I'd like to turn to you to talk a little bit about what these conversations are, and then pivot to what you are learning from these conversations.
Part of the authentic diversity strategy that our church adopted in 2019 was to have groups in synods address anti-racism, address white supremacy, address other sins of economic injustice and isolation from each other in very local ways. And our synod has done that. We have just recently established an authentic diversity task force as our effort to address these things. That group is a collection of very different people who all have a great passion that we become more successful in overcoming these obstacles. And I guess I would see that the goal of that group is more really to reach out and know our neighbors and to be part of the solution than it is to accomplish the goal of being a more multi-ethnic and multi-racial church. We do want that, but even that is an internal goal, and this group is looking more externally. We want to be part of the solution of healing the sins of racism and white supremacy in our country. So that's one of the things that we have done. There's another thing that is happening more in the behind the scenes and still in progress, and that is part of the Day of Repentance and Commemoration of the Emmanuel 9 commits our church to continue to strive to establish relationships with the AME Church.
Mm-hmm.
And even now, Bishop Frank Reed and I are in email conversation working toward growing in relationship. He's the AME bishop that is, whose territory overlaps our synod.
Yeah.
And it's taking work. We live in different cities and have different things on our calendars, but we're at it. And I think that's another thing that is that has come out of our church's effort, is an intentional desire to work on relationships across those church and racial boundaries.
One of the things that I know is happening with these synod-wide conversations on racism, you've been having small groups meet, I guess, of rostered clergy and lay leaders from these Lutheran churches. And you seem to have been heartened in our prep conversation by the fact that people seem to be desperately interested and
Yes.
committed to being a part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back to the video that is just burned into our memories of watching George Floyd not just die, but be killed, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has just raised up in so many people, in our church as well, a passion, a desperate passion to make our world different, to make it a place where that doesn't happen. And to see in that not just an incidental occasion or accident, but to see in it a manifestation of systemic white supremacy and racism manifest in a very public way, but something that is latent and also present inside all of us in the choices that we make and the way that we live our lives. And that shock, that awakening of conscience is something that has happened to our people too. And there is a desperate passion to do something to make our world different so that we don't just continue to be who we have been up until now.
Melissa, what are you hearing from folks who are participating in these conversations?
For some, this is the first time they've had this kind of conversation. So to offer space for fear and worry and to hold that as they approach is, I think, an important part of what we do. We've been talking as a task force and we're a relatively new group of people gathered, and we haven't actually met in person yet because we started gathering the end of March. So with all the things that are that we miss when we are not in in-person gatherings, there has been somewhat of a gift in that people have become more familiar with using online gatherings. In that sense, I don't know that we would have been able to have synod-wide conversations the way that we have had them if people hadn't already started to push the boundaries of being comfortable with technology. Which when we spoke the other week, we also talked about some of the gift of technology in that the distance sometimes that this provides helps people walk a little closer because the vulnerability isn't quite there at the same level. That being said, people are walking and wondering and learning. And I think the thing that I'm seeing is they're saying, I don't want to just learn. I want to be a part of something. I want to be a part of something more. I don't want to just read my book and say that was a great book and then close it and put it back on the shelf.
Yeah. And we'll talk about the conversation around how we help people do better, because obviously if it were just a matter of will, the ELCA, as well as all the other denominations, would have successfully done something about it 30 or more years ago. We do have a question. The question is, I really appreciate the conversation on how being a diverse church shouldn't be the initial goal. The goal should be to dismantle these systems and repair relationships. What would you say to other organizations that attempt these Band-Aid approaches to solving racism? For those who say, if we just get more people of color to show up, we'll be good. Lenny Duncan names this as a problem a bit in his book, and Austin Channing Brown talks about it in her book as well. But what can and should organizations, well, like the LCA, like PTS, be doing? Just as a sidebar, I'm remembering that this was an important part of a conversation we had when Daniel Hill, an evangelical white pastor and author of Wide Awake, did a workshop with us last year. He said he would rather belong to a church that had as its primary goal addressing its issues of white supremacy and white privilege than a church that has as its goal being more diverse.
Yeah.
And I think that this connects this question here with some of the observations being made. I'll let you rock, paper, scissors. Who rocked this first?
I always defer to the bishop.
And I'll ask you to follow up when I fail to answer as fully as I should. The sinister nature of sin, as we understand it, is that it can turn all good things into evil. God has given us the gift of creation, the gift of work, the gift of identity, the gift of sexuality. All these things are good gifts, and we find a way to turn them into evil through the power of sin. So the goal of being a more diverse church is a good thing. It's a good goal, but we turn it into a manifestation of self-interest when explicitly or implicitly we think that will make us look better, right? I mean, it's self-serving.
And it instrumentalizes and objectifies the persons who will be used in support of your goal.
Especially if, I mean, you can name it. We want you to come and make us look better. Oh, you know, how is that the church? Yes, so that's how I would understand how focusing on that goal itself can be part of the systemic sin that we are stuck in. So the answer, which is as simple as anything to say, and the hardest thing in the world to do, is simply to be self-giving, to be more interested in the other than the self, which is what Jesus teaches us. Jesus teaches us this not only in his words, but going all the way to the cross, where he literally dies and gives himself, and in the sacrament beforehand, where he takes bread and wine and breaks them and pours them out and says, look, this is me. I am the one who tears myself apart for you, who pours myself out for you. I mean, it's as simple as that. Now, it's hard as nails for us to do it. But I think it is more, I think that's the path. Rather than setting goals and accomplishing them to serve our self-interest, finding ways to give ourselves away in interest in the other. And I mean, it's like St. Francis says, it's in dying that we live. It's in giving ourselves away that we find our life. And that's so counterintuitive that it's hard to make a program out of that, because it's giving away, it's self denial for the sake of the other.
I'm thinking too that the challenge is that these words ring true, especially for those of us who are white and who are in a position of power or privilege that does need that kind of kenotic check, where we are being called to deny self, to give things up. That self-denial is heard really differently from communities whose rights and privileges and full humanhood have been denied by the systems that have kept those folks in power in place. So this is a helpful check for those of us who are white and need to call to accountability for the privileges that we enjoy. But it's heard differently among other communities too. I'm thinking about one of the first things I know a number of white, well-meaning white folk do is in the the horror of not only the realization of the situation that we're in with systemic racism, but the desire to do something about it. They want to turn to people of color to teach them what needs to happen.
Yeah.
That's problematic because it places the double burden of experiencing the oppression as well as educating people about that oppression on the person whose situation has been recognized anew. And yet what we seem to be calling for in this conversation is authentic relationship. That is a theme that both of you have talked about. It's an awareness of the need to be in relationship with each other, which is, I think, also at the heart of the question that we were asked. Melissa, please, the bishop said he would be turning to you. What are your thoughts about the difference or the tension between desiring diversity, but also the call to be in authentic relationship and become aware of our own complicity in these structures?
I'm not sure that I could build much more on what the bishop said, except just emphasize that if we make diversity the idol, it becomes that. So if that's, I mean, it's so easily, and we do it usually in a sense of saying, bring more people to us, to come be like us, to assimilate. I mean, that's a pretty powerful word, but even as we talk about in our congregations, welcoming more people, are we looking to change and create space for what that means to welcome more, and to provide spaces of listening and learning and welcoming those who may not fit the demographic, the idea, the behaviors of who is a good church person, who's a good Lutheran. And even the identity of what it means to be Lutheran. I think you have all heard the jokes, and I grew up in southern Minnesota, and I had lutefisk every Christmas, much to my horror. But that, what does that mean to be Lutheran? And some of my friends who have said that they have walked into congregations and people say, "You can't be Lutheran." Are you really? And yeah, my whole life. Thank you very much. So how do we expand and grow and learn and be curious about the wideness of God's work in our Lutheran understanding, in our Lutheran tradition, and our heritage?
So we need to create spaces to have these conversations and to do our work to affect a posture of curiosity. I know, Bishop, when we were talking, you talked about the function of imagination. So many well-intentioned people don't quite know where to start, and we talked about this as a failure of pastoral and interpersonal imagination. I'm wondering, and this is related to a quote that I took from you, Bishop. You said that the ELCA has beautiful theological documents as part of its heritage, but that hasn't moved us toward changed behaviors. Yet it still stands that the ELCA has a unique contribution to make to this work. I'd love to turn to you and ask you what you think the unique gift of the ELCA is to this hard work of anti-racism is.
Yeah, good, thank you. Sometimes I think of the whole Christian church as a symphony orchestra, and each church body having a very different voice in that. So you can look at each one and say, this is the unique characteristic of this instrument, and this is the gift it brings. But really, it's only when they're used all together that they're any good, right? I mean, you have brief solos, but the thing ought to be together. So I think the gift that the Lutheran Church historically brings is a very solid theology that is grounded in human reality. We put all of our confidence in the work of Christ and not our own work to be saved. I mean, we call that grace, that the gift of salvation is God's work and not ours. We can't get it, and the harder we try, the farther away we get from it. We're just really realistic about that. So we call that grace. It's God's love. It's not something we earn. Theologically, that frees us then to be available to the neighbor, to serve without self-interest, without worrying or thinking, or strategizing, does this increase my chances of being saved? I mean, that's just off the table. That's done. Christ has done it. That's a gift that we bring. That's manifest in the great track record of social ministry that the Lutheran Church has accomplished in this country and around the world. And I think that's worth saying. But it's also the case that that gift that we bring needs all the other gifts for it to be used well in the whole body of Christ. And there are other churches that bring a deeper emphasis on our being together in relationship, or a deeper emphasis on responding to the needs of the world out of the thing that we're facing right now, emphasis on worship, emphasis on praising and glorifying God in an ecstatic way. Each of these needs to be used together. But I think our gift, I think quite honestly, is a really solid systematic theology.
Your response actually perfectly tees up a question that's just come in. This person asks, I've been thinking about the overwhelming change that came in the 16th century within the Western Church. Of course, I'm thinking about the Reformation. Could it be that major changes need a Reformation? Could this be a Reformation time?
Oh, I think it is. And I think it's also true that reformations are seldom planned, right? They happen. And in that case, we would call them spirit-led. I think if you look around the country today, you will see there's a thing happening. And it has not so much been planned as it is taking the decades of hard work of many people and suddenly making it the right moment. So yeah, I believe the moment we are in is a Reformation moment, but
it does
we can't
feel
take credit
different.
for it.
It does. I've spoken to a number of activists who say that it does feel different.
Yep.
And it could be some of the single-minded focus we're able to give some of this, given the lack of distraction in the middle of the pandemic. And there are a lot of sort of sociological reasons people might give, but I'll take your spirit-led one and run with it.
Well, yes.
The church.
I mean, 100 years before Luther, Jan Hus said all the same things, but he did not have the particular social dynamics and the invention of the printing press and the invention of the postal system that just made it all happen. And I think the same thing is true right now. There are things coming together that we could not have created, but let's not lose this opportunity either.
Last question we'll take right now. I'm going to throw this one at you, Melissa.
Okay.
Years ago, theologian Kelly Brown Douglas spoke at PTS, and someone asked her a question about whether predominantly white churches should really be trying to become more racially diverse, given that church functions as a safe space for so many people of color. Professor Douglas answered by saying she believes that until most spaces in society are truly safe for people of color, churches are going to continue to be segregated because people of color will seek sanctuary in worship spaces where they can avoid the white gaze. How do you respond to that? If our worship spaces aren't necessarily hospitable to diverse groups of people, how might we go about repairing relationships in other settings? I'll just add that what I see an implicit tension between is the work of the church as it's outward facing and missional, and the idea of getting people into churches, the tension that's there. But the reason I'm directing this question to you is because of your work with new and renewing communities.
Yeah. So I think my mind went like 12 different directions. And where I'll settle now is, again, the desire to bring people in to be like us. And that is a safe space when we can bring new people in who wish to be exactly like we are right now, for example. But I don't think that's what the Spirit's calling us to do. So I have wrestled myself with, again, the diversity question. Do we bring people in to make us more diverse, and that becomes our goal? Or what is the Spirit calling us? What is God calling us to? How is God calling us to be in relationship? And a part of this is the new ways that we are now encountering and understanding what church is, what the body of Christ is. Even in the last 5 months, the explosion of how we gather and what is real church gathering, real online as opposed to virtual even, or real in new spaces. So I'm wrestling with the question of safety, and I need more guidance there, because I think for me I would say as well that church is a place where I can feel safe, but I'm not called to stay there. And church worship space, maybe that 1 hour a week is now expanding, and I'm going 12 different directions. New ministry, what if worship no longer is just 1 hour, but parts of our liturgy happen throughout the day and throughout the week? Mary Hinkle Shore would speak when she talks about Luther's 7 marks of the church, that worship on Sunday is a dress rehearsal for the rest of the week. What if church is the rest of the week, and the new ways that we can be together and be with one another and worship is happening throughout the week now instead of just Sunday, so that there are places of safety and renewal and places where we're also sent out as a part of our worship and engaging in the community.
And animated to work on those relationships that are the necessary precursor to the truly diverse, beloved community. As we turn towards home, I'd like each of you to think about one hope that you have, or one good word you would give, particularly since the purpose of these conversations has been to help galvanize and animate the White Church commitment to doing this work. What would you want people to know as they sign off today? What would you want them to leave with? Melissa, I'll start with you and then have Bishop Kusserow bring us home.
So the refrain that has been coming through my mind a lot is the message that we get from angels as they come and surprise you with all sorts of new things, which is be not afraid, engage the conversations, and speak with one another, ask questions, be vulnerable, get uncomfortable, but know that you have people who walk alongside you, so that we do not come into a place of shame that paralyzes us and keeps us from moving forward. This is our call. This is church being church. Be not afraid. We go together.
Bishop Kusserow, can you top that?
No, not at all. Well said. Well said. Our faith teaches us to see in Jesus dying on the cross life itself. So the word of hope that I think I would wish for those who are listening to capture and take with them is that the thing that we are about, which is the beloved community, will require those, most all of us, to give up more than we think we can give. And the miracle of it is, in giving up more than we think we can give, we will be finding a life far greater than anything we could have attained by our own getting. That's the hope. It's trust. It's the leap of faith, but our Lord Jesus models that and makes that reality for us.
Thank you for the invitation to cast bread upon the waters. And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you to all of you who dialed in and listened. A recording of this will be available soon, and then available either by request to me at hblyer@pts.edu or through the Race and Faith website, resource pages on the PTS website. Bishop Kusserow, Reverend Stoller, thank you so much for being with us. Folks, I'd invite you to join us next week when we continue our Judicatory Leadership tour, and we have Bishop Cynthia Moore-Kokoy of the Western PA Conference of the United Methodist Church, and the Reverend Deborah Mason, who's the coordinator for diversity development and inclusion for the Methodist Conference. Again, thank you. It's been a pleasure hosting you today. Be well.
Thank you. Helen.